I met Sarah in college. She was the kind of woman who turned heads effortlessly, beautiful, intelligent, and full of a quiet confidence that drew people toward her. I was lucky. I knew it then, and I know it now. We started dating in our sophomore year, and by the time we graduated, I was certain she was the one. Our love felt unbreakable, like a force of nature. Sarah had a way of making the ordinary feel special. A quiet night at home became an adventure with her. She was spontaneous, always planning little surprises, always looking for the next thrill. It was part of what made me fall for her, but maybe, just maybe, it was also a warning sign I failed to see. We married young, built a life together, and for the most part, it was a good one. I work in finance, structured, logical, precise. Sarah, on the other hand, is an artist. She paints, sculpts, and teaches art at a local community center. Our worlds were different, but we complemented each other. She brought color into my structured life. I gave her stability in return. Or at least I thought I did. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but I never thought it was fragile. Sure, Sarah had always been restless, easily bored, but I figured that was just her nature. I worked hard to keep things exciting for her, vacations, date nights, gifts. And she always seemed appreciative, her eyes lighting up whenever I surprised her with something new. If someone had told me that she would betray me in the way she did, I would have laughed in their face. Sarah loved me, or so I thought. I never imagined she would seek out something else, someone else, in the most twisted and unforgivable way possible. I trusted her. I trusted my father. And that was my greatest mistake. Looking back, I wonder if the signs were always there, buried beneath years of routine and familiarity. Maybe I was just too blind to see them. Or maybe I saw them and chose to ignore them, convinced that love alone was enough to hold us together. Sarah had always been restless. It was part of what made her exciting, unpredictable. She craved novelty, adventure. She hated feeling stuck in one place for too long. I used to love that about her. Now I see it differently. Lately, she'd been more distant. Not in an obvious way, not in a way that raised alarms, at least not at first. She still smiled at me, still kissed me when I came home from work. But there was something missing in her touch, a hollowness in the way she looked at me. She started spending more time at her art studio. She claimed she had taken on extra students, was working on a new collection. I didn't question it. She was passionate about her work, and I never wanted to be the kind of husband who stifled his wife's dreams. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. The way she clutched her phone when I walked into the room, how she started going out more on weekends, how she seemed distracted even when we were together. I told myself it was nothing. We had been married for nearly 7 years. Maybe this was just a phase, a rough patch. Every couple had them. I just never thought ours would end the way it did. The first real warning came at my parents' house. My father, a man I had always admired, had started acting differently around Sarah. At first, I brushed it off. He was charming, charismatic, people naturally gravitated toward him. But then I noticed the way his eyes lingered on her a little too long. The way his hand would rest on her back when he thought I wasn't looking. The hushed conversations that ended the moment I walked into the room. It was subtle. But it was there. And I ignored it. Because the alternative was unthinkable. I tried to shake the feeling that something was off, but doubt clung to me like a shadow. I wasn't the jealous type. I never had been. Sarah had always been free-spirited, and I never wanted to be the kind of husband who smothered his wife with suspicions. But lately, something about her felt different. She was more guarded. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things. The way she angled her phone screen away from me, the way she seemed preoccupied even when we were together. She was affectionate, but it felt rehearsed, like muscle memory rather than real emotion. One night, we were having dinner at my parents' house. My mother had made roast chicken, the same meal she had been making for family gatherings since I was a kid. It should have felt comforting, familiar. But the entire evening, something felt wrong. Sarah and my father sat across from each other. Their conversations were casual, too casual. My father laughed at her jokes a little too hard. She held his gaze a little too long. And when she reached for the serving platter, his hand, accidentally, brushed hers and lingered just a second too long. My mother noticed it too. I caught her watching them, her lips pressed into a tight line, her eyes darting to me as if trying to gauge my reaction. But what was I supposed to say? That my father, my own flesh and blood, was acting like a flirtatious teenager around my wife? I told myself I was imagining things. I had to be. That night, Sarah was more distant than ever. When we got home, she said she was tired and went straight to bed. I stayed up, sitting alone in the dark, staring at the flickering light of the television without really watching. A nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered that something was happening, something I wasn't ready to face. But I wasn't ready to confront it yet. I wasn't ready to believe that the woman I loved, the woman I had built my life with, was slipping away from me. And I sure as hell wasn't ready to believe that my own father might have something to do with it. The night it started, I had no idea. I went to bed like any other night, exhausted from work, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath my own roof. If I had known what was happening, what Sarah was doing, I would have never closed my eyes. She told me she was going to my father's house to drop off some paperwork for him. Something about a business license he needed help with. It made sense, she had been handling some of his paperwork for a while now. I didn't think twice about it. "Don't wait up," she said, kissing me on the forehead before grabbing her keys. I nodded, already half asleep. "Love you?" She hesitated. Just for a second. "Love you too." And then she was gone. I don't know what time it happened. Maybe an hour after she left, maybe two. But at some point, my mother, who had long suspected something was wrong, got up from bed to grab some water. That's when she heard them. Soft murmurs coming from my father's study. At first, she thought he was just working late, speaking on the phone. But then she heard Sarah's voice. Low. Breathless. The kind of voice a woman only uses in moments of intimacy. My mother froze. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. Maybe she had misheard. Maybe it wasn't Sarah at all. But then, there was a sound that shattered any doubt. Sarah's laugh, light and teasing, followed by the unmistakable sound of a moan. The glass of water slipped from my mother's hand and shattered on the kitchen tile. Silence. Then hurried whispers. Footsteps. A door opening. She turned to see Sarah, half-dressed, her blouse clutched to her chest, staring at her with wide, guilty eyes. My father stepped out behind her. His face, my own father's face, held no shame. Only cold, quiet acceptance, as if he had been caught doing something inevitable. "Get out," my mother said, her voice trembling with rage. "Get out of this house." Sarah looked at my father, but he said nothing. He didn't defend her. Didn't defend himself. And just like that, the illusion was shattered. My mother didn't call me that night. She waited. Maybe she wanted to be sure. Maybe she needed time to decide how to tell me that my wife, the woman I had loved and trusted, had betrayed me in the worst way imaginable. But the truth had already been set in motion. And once it started, there was no stopping it. I was at work when my phone buzzed. It was my mother. That wasn't unusual. She called me often, sometimes just to check in, sometimes to invite Sarah and me over for dinner. But something about this call felt different. "Hey, Mom," I answered, balancing my phone between my ear and shoulder as I typed an email. There was silence on the other end. A heavy silence. "Mom? You need to come over." Her voice was tight, strained, like she was holding something back. I frowned. "What's wrong? Is Dad okay?" She let out a bitter laugh, one that sent a shiver down my spine. "Just come. Please." Something in her tone made my stomach drop. I left work early, heart pounding the entire drive to my parents' house. I ran through possibilities in my head, but nothing could have prepared me for what was waiting. When I arrived, my mother was sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her expression unreadable. "Mom, what's going on?" I asked, dropping my keys onto the counter. She looked up at me, and for a moment she just stared. Like she was trying to find the right words, the least painful way to say what needed to be said. But there was no easy way to say it. "It's Sarah," she finally whispered. I felt my chest tighten. "What about her?" My mother inhaled sharply, gripping her cup tighter. "She's been having an affair." The words punched the air from my lungs. I stumbled back, shaking my head. No. No, there's no way. She wouldn't. My mother's eyes darkened. "With your father?" Everything inside me went cold. My mind refused to process the words. I let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "What? No. That's not. I saw them, David." Her voice broke. "Here. In this house. Last night." The room spun. I gripped the counter to steady myself. My own father. The man I had looked up to my entire life. The man who had raised me. The betrayal hit like a knife to the gut. "I told her to get out," my mother continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "She left. But your father, he didn't even try to deny it." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Sarah. My father. They had destroyed everything. And I had no idea what I was supposed to do next. I don't remember leaving my parents' house. One moment, I was standing in their kitchen, my mother's voice ringing in my ears. The next, I was in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I felt hollow. Numb. My mind refused to accept what I had just heard. Sarah, my Sarah, had betrayed me. But not just with anyone. With my own father. I couldn't process it. I didn't want to. My first instinct was to call her, demand an explanation, force her to tell me this was all some kind of sick misunderstanding. But deep down, I already knew the truth. My mother wouldn't lie. She had seen it with her own eyes. So instead I drove home. Not to confront her, not yet. I needed time. Space. But when I pulled into the driveway, there she was, sitting on the porch steps, waiting for me. She stood when she saw me, her face pale, her eyes wide with something that almost looked like remorse. Almost. "David," she started. "Don't." My voice came out harsher than I intended, but I didn't care. She flinched but didn't move. "Please, just let me explain." I let out a bitter laugh. "Explain? What exactly do you think you can explain, Sarah?" Tears welled in her eyes. "It wasn't." She hesitated, swallowed hard. "It didn't mean anything." I felt something inside me snap. "Didn't mean anything?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You slept with my father, Sarah. In his house. And you're telling me it didn't mean anything?" Her lips trembled. I was confused. Confused? I took a step closer, and she took a step back. "You weren't confused when you married me. You weren't confused when you told me you loved me. So tell me, when exactly did you start getting confused? When you let my father touch you? When you let him?" "Stop," she whispered, tears now spilling down her cheeks. "Please, just stop." I shook my head, disgusted. "You don't get to cry. You don't get to beg for my understanding. Not after what you did." She was sobbing now, arms wrapped around herself like she was the victim. "I made a mistake," she choked out. I let out a cold, humorless laugh. "No, Sarah. A mistake is forgetting to lock the door at night. A mistake is burning dinner. This?" I gestured between us. "This was a choice." She wiped at her tears, but I didn't care. I had loved this woman. Given her everything. And she had thrown it all away. "I need time," I said, stepping past her toward the door. She reached for my arm, but I pulled away like her touch burned me. "David, please. Just get out." She stared at me, her face crumbling. "What?" I said, "Get out." My voice was steady now. Cold. Pack your things and leave. Where am I supposed to go? I laughed again, shaking my head. Maybe my father's house. You seemed comfortable enough there. Her face twisted in pain, but I didn't care. I walked inside, slammed the door behind me, and locked it. Sarah was no longer my wife. She was nothing to me now. I stood in the silence of my home, breathing heavily, my hands clenched into fists. I could still hear Sarah sobbing on the other side of the door, but I refused to open it. Let her cry. Let her feel even a fraction of the pain she had inflicted on me. After what felt like an eternity, I heard her footsteps retreat. A car door opened, then slammed shut. The engine roared to life, and just like that, she was gone. I should have felt relief. Instead, all I felt was empty. I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands. My mind kept replaying the last few minutes, the betrayal, the way she had stood there crying like she was the victim. Like she hadn't destroyed everything we built together. Then, another thought hit me like a gut punch. My father. He had done this too. I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling with rage. I found his number, my thumb hovering over the call button. But what could I say? What words could possibly contain the level of betrayal he had committed? I wasn't just angry. I was disgusted. He was my father, the man I had looked up to my entire life. The man who had taught me how to ride a bike, how to throw a baseball, how to be a man. And now, he had taken my wife, the woman I had loved more than anything. I needed answers. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and stormed out of the house. The drive to my parents' home was a blur, my vision clouded by fury. I didn't even remember pulling into the driveway until I was already out of the car, banging on the front door. After a few agonizing seconds, the door creaked open. My father stood there, dressed casually in a polo and slacks, as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just destroyed his own son's life. "David," he said, his expression unreadable. I clenched my fists. "Don't you dare say my name like we're fine." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I suppose your mother told you." I let out a bitter laugh. "You suppose? Are you kidding me right now?" "I won't make excuses," he said, stepping aside. "Come in. Let's talk." I didn't want to talk. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to knock him to the ground and make him feel even an ounce of the humiliation and betrayal that had been dumped onto me. But I stepped inside anyway. Because I needed to hear it from him. I needed to know how he could do this to me. How he could destroy our family. And worse, how he could look me in the eye and act like he still deserved to be called my father. I stepped inside, my hands shaking with rage. My father closed the door behind me, moving with a calmness that only made my fury boil hotter. How could he be so composed? How could he look me in the eye after what he'd done? "Sit down, David," he said, gesturing to the living room. I scoffed. "I'm not sitting down. You're going to stand there and explain to me how the hell you thought sleeping with my wife was acceptable." His jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. He had always been good at keeping his emotions in check, a skill I once admired. Now, it only made me sick. "I didn't plan for this to happen," he said. "It just did." I let out a cold, humorless laugh. "That's it? That's all you have to say?" He exhaled, rubbing his temples like this conversation was exhausting him. Like he was the victim here. "I know you won't believe me," he said, "but I never wanted to hurt you." I clenched my fists. "You didn't just hurt me. You destroyed everything. My marriage. Our family. Do you even realize that?" Before he could respond, another voice cut through the room. "I can't listen to this anymore." We both turned to see my mother standing in the hallway, her face pale with rage. She had been quiet until now, but the fire in her eyes told me she had reached her breaking point. "You don't get to stand there and act like this was some accident, Richard," she spat. "You made a choice. Both of you did. And now you're going to deal with the consequences." My father's expression darkened. "Linda. Don't you Linda me," she snapped. I stood by you for decades. I raised our son with you. And this? This is how you repay me? I swallowed hard, watching the woman who had always been the pillar of our family tremble with anger. I had never seen her like this before. You've humiliated us, she continued. You've humiliated me. I've kept quiet long enough, but I won't anymore. I've already started the divorce process. You and your little fling can rot together for all I care. I looked at my father, waiting for his reaction, but he just stood there, his face blank. He had nothing to say. Because he knew he deserved it. My mother turned to me then, her gaze softening. David, I didn't want to be the one to tell you. But you needed to know. I nodded, my throat tight. Thank you for telling me. I don't know what to do now. She reached for my hand, squeezing it. You do what you need to do. You don't owe either of them anything. I looked back at my father, at the man I had once respected more than anyone in the world. I never want to see you again, I said, my voice shaking. You're dead to me. For the first time, something flickered across his face, maybe guilt, maybe regret, but I didn't care. I turned on my heel and walked out of the house, leaving behind the man who had betrayed me, the father I once had. And I knew then that nothing would ever be the same again. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My father's face, his empty, expressionless stare, was burned into my mind. The man who had taught me right from wrong, who had once been my hero, had just stood there, emotionless, as I cut him out of my life. And Sarah. She hadn't even tried to fight for us. She hadn't begged me to forgive her or attempted to lie her way out of it. Maybe she knew there was no point. Maybe she didn't care. Either way, she had thrown everything away. For what? For a fling with my father? I couldn't let this go unanswered. I wouldn't. When I got home, Sarah's car was already parked outside. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, and there she was, sitting on the couch, eyes red and swollen from crying. She stood up as soon as she saw me. David! Shut up! I snapped. My voice was ice cold, and she flinched like I had struck her. She opened her mouth again, but I held up a hand. You don't get to speak. You don't get to explain. There is nothing you can say to justify what you did. Tears welled in her eyes again. I never wanted to hurt you. I laughed, shaking my head. That's rich. You didn't want to hurt me, so you slept with my father? In his house? I took a step closer, lowering my voice to a dangerous calm. How long, Sarah? How long has this been going on? She swallowed, looking away. A few months, she admitted. I felt the last of my self-control snap. I turned, walking straight to the bedroom. David, wait. I ignored her, yanking open the closet and grabbing every expensive purse, every designer dress, every piece of jewelry I had ever gifted her. What are you doing? She cried. I turned to her, my face hard. These aren't yours anymore. I threw them into a trash bag, barely containing my rage. You don't get to keep the gifts I gave you while you were screwing my father behind my back. She rushed forward, grabbing my arm. David, please, let's talk. I wrenched away from her touch like it was poison. No. You don't get to beg now. I pointed to the bedroom door. Get your things and get out. Her lip trembled. Where am I supposed to go? I laughed bitterly. I don't care. Go to my father's house. You two deserve each other. She let out a choked sob, but I didn't care. I grabbed a suitcase, tossed it onto the bed, and started shoving her clothes inside. David, please. I zipped the suitcase shut and shoved it toward her. Get out. She hesitated for a moment, like she thought I might change my mind. But then, realizing there was no forgiveness coming, she grabbed the suitcase and walked toward the door. I followed her, watching as she stepped onto the porch. She turned back, her face full of regret. I did love you, she whispered. I met her eyes, my voice empty. No, you didn't. And with that I shut the door in her face. The moment the door slammed shut, a suffocating silence filled the house. Sarah was gone. My father was dead to me. And my mother, she was the only one who had stood by me, but even she was broken, betrayed in a way that could never be undone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, waiting to feel something, relief, closure, anything. But all I felt was exhaustion. I wasn't done yet. I grabbed my phone and scrolled to my father's contact. With a deep breath, I typed the last words I would ever say to him. You are no longer my father. Lose my number. Don't ever contact me again. I hit send and immediately blocked his number. I did the same for Sarah. Whatever pain they felt, whatever regret they had, if they had any, I didn't care. They had made their choices. Now they would live with the consequences. I spent the next few hours erasing Sarah from my life. I tore down every picture of us, threw her remaining belongings into garbage bags, and dumped them on the curb. I even deleted our wedding photos from my phone, wiping away the last remnants of a life I had once thought was unshakable. Then, I turned to the legal side of things. I called my lawyer. I need to start divorce proceedings. Immediately. He didn't ask why. I think he could hear it in my voice. Next, I changed the locks. By the time night fell, my house no longer felt like ours. It was mine. Just mine. And yet, I still felt haunted. I poured myself a drink and sat in the dim living room, the weight of everything settling onto my shoulders. The betrayal, the humiliation, the loss, it was overwhelming. But I wasn't broken. Not completely. Because now, finally, I was free. The days that followed were strange, quiet. I woke up alone, went to work, came home to an empty house. At first, the silence was unbearable. The absence of Sarah's presence felt like a phantom limb, something I knew was gone, yet I still expected to be there. But as time passed, the silence became comforting. Peaceful, even. I threw myself into work, into the gym, into anything that kept my mind occupied. My mother and I grew closer, we leaned on each other, both of us struggling to process the betrayal we had suffered at the hands of the same man. She finalized her divorce from my father within weeks, cutting him out of her life just as I had. I never spoke to him again. Sarah tried to reach out once. An email. Some long-winded apology about how she had made a mistake, how she regretted everything. I didn't respond. She didn't deserve a response. The divorce went smoothly. She fought for some assets at first, but I refused to give in. After seeing how determined I was, she gave up. She walked away with nothing but the clothes she packed that night. Good. Months passed. Then a year. The anger faded, replaced by something softer, acceptance. I stopped looking at my past like it was a wound that would never heal. Instead, I saw it for what it was, a lesson. A brutal, gut-wrenching lesson, but one I survived. And survival meant something. One evening, I found myself at a coffee shop, waiting in line, lost in thought. That's when I saw her. She wasn't Sarah. She wasn't anything like Sarah. She smiled at me, warm, genuine. A stranger, yet something about her felt safe. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled back. Because life moves forward. And so would I.